All right, good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Woo! People, wow, more energy than I thought in the last session of the day, and I know that we're standing between you and happy hour. So if you're really energetic and you ask lots of questions, short questions, then we may cut it a few minutes short so you can get there faster. I'm Shannon Kellogg, and I'm the Director of Public Policy here in the Americas for Amazon Web Services. Pleased to join you today. Thanks again to everybody for coming to the summit. We're really thrilled to have an opportunity to feature two of our really interesting partners during this session today from the National Democratic Institute and the World Bank. And I'm going to introduce Chris and Marietta here in a moment, and then I'm going to join them to do some Q&A after they provide some opening remarks. And then we're going to go to the audience. And one thing that I will let you know that if we don't get some questions from the audience, we do start putting people on the spot with the roving mic. Chris Doulton is the Chief Innovation Officer of the National Democratic Institute. Chris is he leads the NDI tech team, and he has designed and implemented programs in dozens of countries which apply integrated, context-appropriate technology to reach more citizens, track political processes, and improve organizing capabilities and open data. Having previously worked for the campaigns of President Obama and Hillary Clinton, Chris is skilled at the pragmatic application of cutting-edge digital communications, big data, and organizing tools in political campaigns, which is good because NDI does a lot of political work abroad in supporting the development of political parties and civic institutions. Marietta, and here it goes, Marietta, I'm going to try not to mangle your name, Marietta Mwanga Savume, yes, is the program manager for Cloud Program Management Office in the World Bank. And she's had a distinguished career at a number of institutions over the years, including UNICEF. And she may draw on some of those experiences during the panel, but currently she has she's at the World Bank, and she has over 20 years of experience driving innovation, building organizational, team, and individual IT capabilities within the World Bank, and maximizing the impact of multi-million-dollar IT programs for development and security globally. So we're pleased to have you here as well, Marietta. So I'm going to go ahead and join these two fine individuals. See if the mic is still working. Wow, that's magic. And let me start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about how cloud computing is contributing to the mission of your organizations, and even some of the transformational effects that cloud is having both internally and in some of your external work. And starting with you, Chris.
Great. Yeah, so NDI is itself a big consumer of Amazon Web Services. We've moved about 150 servers out into the cloud there, thinking about turning our server room into like a ball pit or something to make it a little bit more useful. But that's not particularly interesting compared to the other folks here. What we do that I think is a little bit more fun is working with hundreds of public sector organizations around the world, local governments, legislatures and MPs, political parties, civil society organizations and NGOs, try and help them do their job better, faster, reach more people, cheaper with judicious application of tech. And cloud is just a huge part of it. When you think about the challenges that emerging countries face with catching up to where their citizens are, increasingly folks all have a digitally connected computer in their pocket, and they're used to being able to get food and rides and dates from those devices. But meanwhile, these political institutions that are so important in their lives are kind of mired in the, if you're lucky, kind of mid-20th century in methods of communication stuff. So cloud is a really transformational opportunity for these groups to be able to cut out all the infrastructure, get out of the business of the hard tech stuff, and just move on to solving some of their problems. We work with groups like, say, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. If you're in that kind of line of work, you didn't do that as a backdoor to become a Linux systems administrator. And so we find Amazon and other cloud service providers extremely useful for kind of abstracting away that sort of set of technology problems.
Excellent. Marietta?
I think like NDI, we're I wouldn't say seasoned, but we're a fairly knowledgeable user of AWS, and we're actually at the bank gearing up to do mass migration in the coming year. But besides our own internal move of workloads to the cloud, I think the bank is in a unique position as a convener for a number of private sector on the one hand and governments on the other, because our work is both developmental work through governments, but developmental work also through investing through private sector. And I think that position actually gives us a good space to be able to convene or provide knowledge for governments and developing countries to move to new technologies. If you will recall, a few years ago when the mobile phone came on, there was the societies that had never had a landline, and they frog jumped to mobile phone. And I think that's probably what's happening right now with a lot of developing countries. So we see ourselves in a space where we can help through two ways. We can help as we provide investments through whether they may be telcos that are willing to invest in developing countries, or supporting governments as they develop their own systems, and helping them through, sometimes it's through let's do it together and then you see, and sometimes it is through direct financial investment. And our president in recent times has also very much encouraged the three-way investment approach for the bank, the governments, the World Bank, as well as private sector. So I see that as the sort of three pillars that would propel a lot of our clients in these countries to frog jump to cloud and the use of cloud.
Fantastic. Thank you for those opening thoughts. Chris, as I mentioned earlier, you've worked on presidential campaigns here in the U.S., and NDI, of course, supports the development of political parties, the implementation of free and open elections, development of civic institutions abroad, internationally. How is cloud technology being used to enable these free and open elections in your work and the development of civic institutions, lasting civic institutions in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. The election day is sort of the ultimate high stress test for any kind of technology system. Those of you who might remember some major misfire with the Romney campaign. It's really hard to get your tech right on election day, and you don't get to redo it the next day. So we find that cloud is incredibly valuable for managing to size your stuff appropriately. One specific example from our work globally, NDI works with a lot of civic organizations who engage in nonpartisan citizen election monitoring. So hundreds or thousands of citizens will go out on election day to polling stations and report in structured information on what they've seen. It's a very high stakes activity, and it needs to all work flawlessly because you're not going to get a second shot at it. And prep work for this will start months in advance. But we'll start with, say, a medium-sized instance from AWS. Plot along at that at very low cost to our partners. And then the 48 hours or so before an election, you basically get to incredible Hulk it, scale it up to a like 2XL or something really enormous, manage all the data that's coming in on election day, and then shrink it back down again at a cost of just dollars, really, for the institution organization. So they're able to, they don't need to have a huge server farm ready for that short period of time. They're able to make it happen that way. And so that was done in, I'm not going to get them all over the last year, but Tunisia, Morocco, Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, and about a half dozen other countries where we've been using that sort of methodology. For political parties, too, in the run-up to a campaign, cloud is incredibly valuable for them. Many of the people with whom we work don't necessarily start from a place where they have lists of their supporters that are more sophisticated than, if you're lucky, an Excel spreadsheet, or more often just the boss's cell phone. So being able to move to easy to use cloud-hosted CRM systems where they don't need to know how to run the technology under it, but then can tap into the mass communications and voter targeting that are modernizing, transforming campaigns are huge. You know, here domestically, I've always been just a small fish in these big pond campaigns, but the infrastructure required for a major political campaign is just huge, and I know that the same sort of scaling capabilities of cloud make it indispensable and irreplaceable for the massive data sets that are being used these days here domestically.
Great. Well, I want to continue to explore some of the, some of the impacts after political parties actually win elections too, which I know you'll have some thoughts on. But Marietta, you're part of the World Bank's IT group, and you talked a little bit about your current strategy. Could you go into a little more detail in terms of some of the how you're utilizing cloud computing to support some of the programs that your group is really positioned to enable, and how that is leading to more efficiencies, cost savings, and then if you could also maybe even highlight a couple of specific examples of success stories in that area.
So we've started to use the cloud to reach, to provide data. Like I said before, that one of our strengths is the amount of knowledge and the amount of research that the bank has that others can use. So one of the things that we're making available now is to put that access to data into the cloud, so that our clients, who would be governments or even researchers, can actually get it a lot faster. So if you think about the fact that everybody from the central bank of the Maldives, for example, to the London School of Economics would want access to World Bank research, and the connectivity there is not always the same. The ability to actually have the information closer to the client, and that ability has actually helped us quite a bit. And so we've been able to increase the performance and the geographical reach of where our clients are. And it's helped tremendously in terms of the quality of support, technical support that we're giving, in terms of access of information. And I think the other example that I'll give is very recently we moved a lot of our external web, again, the data that our clients and some of our partners are looking at to the cloud. And we had a significant difference in just the performance and the reliability of those services that was quite noticeable. And increasingly we're seeing that. A few years ago, we moved our email to the cloud. And we also have a critical part of our knowledge base, which is information sharing, being a global organization in the cloud. That helps us a lot for when you have teams that are based in DC as well as in Ghana, for example, being able to work on on one document together. And these are not just World Bank teams. These are teams that might be a local investment company that needs to either see or work on a document together with the bank or together with other partners. So these are some examples where we've seen big leaps in terms of reductions in frustrations, faster service, the ability to just deliver quickly and faster and more agile than we'd seen before. And maybe the last example that I would give is internal to the IT organization at the bank, which is when we get all the, a number of requests for clients wanting new apps or new variations in apps, we have our outsourcing developers being able to quickly access and be able to actually develop functionality a lot faster because they're using cloud. And for a huge machinery such as ours, it's actually been quite instrumental in getting those increments in application out faster. So we've seen a significant amount in our own productivity through that.
That's great, and there's some excellent examples in there. And for the audience, as you think about your upcoming questions here in a few minutes, we're going to sort of rotate for some of the internal examples and use cases and effects back to some of the external things that we're talking to Chris about as well. But before we go back to sort of how political parties and the impact of elections and the use of cloud into the sort of governance stage, I wonder if you could also talk a little bit more about some of the internal changes that you're seeing and how you guys operate and achieve your mission, such as where Marietta was going.
Well, for NDI internally, it's been just tremendously valuable, massive cost savings, and we've been able to retool a lot of our internal engineering team to focus on, some people have been increasing their AWS skills, but other people have been able to dive into new areas that we haven't had bandwidth to do before because people were focused on the quotidian care and feeding of a big server farm. So it's been hugely useful for that. It's also been enormously impactful in our work in our the way we implement our programs. With this, what we sometimes call a geek gap that a lot of these public sector groups face around the world, we've been able to, on AWS and with some generous donations from the AWS team, we've been able to run an initiative we call DEM Tools, or our Democracy Toolkit, a bunch of open source web applications that we're able to run at scale and then provide to groups like political parties or civic organizations. So it's really transformed our method of service delivery. NDI has always been what we call in the development parley a capacity building organization. But when you're talking about technology, you can't just tell people how to build, say, a targeted voter list. You have to actually let them try it out for themselves. And so now we have the capability of being able to provide, albeit the basic version, but provide very useful software as a service offerings to them on the back of our AWS infrastructure.
Excellent. So Marietta, going back to thinking about some of your internal best practices and successes, as you interface with governments around the world and other institutions, are they seeking your advice, your group's advice on how, for example, you're leveraging cloud computing and some of the security best practices that you're deploying?
Yes, I think many governments have they grapple with the data sovereignty issue. And so oftentimes they will come to us and say, well, how do we handle that? What happens with that? And while the bank will not provide a list of what do's and don'ts, I think what we're doing to help them answer those questions is to be able to say, let's see how we can use cloud for development, for example. So then we would be able to partner with them and with a cloud provider such as AWS, for example, to be able to create a space where we could use the cloud for some of the work that the governments want to do, so that they would be better able to come to decisions around that. And I think the other example that I want to give that might be able to drive some of this advice home is the bank has funded in the last years a project called Health System Strengthening, and through that project they want to strengthen health systems in countries, and they've partnered with a number of other organizations. But this particular project looks at how you would, for example, take the data of children that who are born without identity. So in a lot of these countries, children are born and they're not registered. And while we don't have this problem in the US, you expect that when the child is 6 and ready to go to school, you go to school and they say, where's the child's birth registration? Well, but the child wasn't registered at birth. So what this project was trying to do, this program, was to be able to try and close the link from when the child is born and give them an identity. Because if you don't have a birth certificate, then you're not a citizen of anywhere. So part of this was using the local tools that were available. So it combined the use of cloud, combined the use of available technology, which was simple mobile phones, to be able to record the birth of the mother, the date of birth of the mother, and the details of and through a cloud service actually record that into a Ministry of Education and Health, and through this begin to show governments that this is possible. and that with time you can take it on, and then you can actually see that the use of cloud is not detrimental to yourselves or to the systems that you can. And if you see the good in it, then you would actually be able to do it. In fact, in one country, in Africa, within a 3-year period, we increased the birth registration of children from about 25% to 70%. So that was a big thing for the government. So it's through some of this doing, show you and see how you do it, that we're getting governments to be more comfortable and more confident that new technologies, they can actually use them even in their sovereign states.
That's really terrific, because those of us who work internationally, that question around data sovereignty often comes up, and I love the work that you guys are doing to really show them some of the things that they can be doing to protect the data and get them more comfortable with cloud, and then have this conversation. Often it's just a red herring out there.
Yes.
That people don't really understand what the security model is and what protections and controls we have in place and practices that we as cloud providers have in place. So that's really cool, the work that you're doing in that area. I'm going to go two more questions, one to each of you, and then we'll go out to the audience. So Chris, going back to this transition from being a political party, winning an election, to actually governing. So what happens then? I mean, once a party comes to power, are they still working to leverage, in your experience, cloud-based technologies to help them achieve some of their agenda, whether that's citizen service related, or even, a lot of parties come to power in some of these emerging democracies based on, more transparency, anti-corruption platforms. How are they leveraging technology once they're elected in office?
Yeah, no, it is a very important way for them to kind of continue their work forward. NDIs often works with these groups to try and help them engage in kind of better policy making, trying to understand the needs of the people they're serving better, and then develop kind of their legislative plans or service plans around that. And so we see a lot of groups that are that do want to move forward using getting information from their people. One great example is in Ukraine, where I'm sure many of you followed with interest the Euromaidan protests that were that really rocked the country and led to some tragic deaths, but a tremendous sea change in the government there. A lot of new members of parliament were swept into power straight out of the square, and came with a real new enthusiasm for wanting to make life better for their constituents. So we have a major program there with a number of MPs and political factions just to do basic constituent service request tracking. It's not sophisticated, but it's more than has ever been done before, to let them reach out to their people. One particularly interesting twist is via text message, being able to blast text message people with simple surveys, kind of call and response answers, and then actually gather data on what people really care about. A lot of political leaders sometimes have in their head that they know what's best for their people, and things like this really help them kind of ground truth those sorts of ideas. The same thing for local governments or other groups that are trying to find out what the community cares about for problems. Two different directions you can go with that. One, petitioning your government has been a factor since we have records of this back to the time of the Egyptians. So in the 21st century, NDI has taken the We the People platform that the Obama White House developed, and we're working to internationalize that and make that accessible. There's a Smart Cities program in Indonesia we're working on. We'll be rolling that out to a number of different places so people can put in their ideas, suggestions for improvement. The community votes them up and down, and then the local government has a responsibility to reply. It doesn't mean that they're going to agree or implement it, but they have to engage with them. Similarly, some programs running in Iraq and Kosovo now that are providing kind of a digital 311 service almost, if you want to think of it that way. Crowdsourced problem reporting, from the proverbial potholes to other more significant problems, where citizens can text in or call in and share some of what they're seeing on the ground. And for countries that don't necessarily have the right sort of bureaucratic infrastructure, or there may be problems there, they can get the real needs of the people and then act on them, which we like to talk a lot about incentives. You're more likely to win re-election if you've done some good stuff for the people along the way.
That's great. Marietta, go to you and then to the audience. How are cloud-based technologies being used in the countries that the World Bank works with to contribute to the growth of the digital economy in those market segments? And do governments increasingly understand the role of cloud computing in developing startups as part of this push toward a digital economy and digital strategy?
I think I'll start with the second part of your question. Prior to coming to DC, I worked in Kenya. And the situation in Kenya, which is the example that I'll use, is very interesting because on the one hand, we have a lot of startups in Kenya. And the government fully recognizes that they don't have the technology infrastructure to support all these startups. So there's been the corresponding changes in policy and accesses for technology to make sure that these startups actually work and take off and do it. So on some level, the government recognizes that the private sector needs to go ahead with that, and that the private sector will thrive on cloud, will thrive on new technologies and innovation. On the other hand, I think it goes back to, well, what happens to the aspect on the digital economy that the government itself works with. So to the extent that in this case, again, I'll use this example, to the extent that they can diversify a lot of the work that they're doing either to the private sector or some sort of parastatals, then you're seeing a lot of enlightenment, if I may use that word, with governments and how they are looking at cloud and using cloud to develop. In Kenya, for example, the government actually supported the use of cloud services for teaching, and actually was able to register companies that were going to use cloud to teach children in rural areas. So you have situations like that. You have also other countries that are maybe a little more conservative, and they're not as forward-looking or forward-thinking in terms of how they have opened up their own markets to cloud. So you have both, but I think that in this case, like I mentioned before, what the bank is trying to do is to try to level the playing field and be able to encourage the countries that are forward-thinking, yes, but also to be able to bring those that are not to be able to see that. And one of the things that we encourage generally with the bank and with the development partners is south-to-south cooperation, and the idea that if we're in the same sort of development circle, I will learn better from you than say from an entity that's light years ahead of it. And I'm sure you find that in India as well. And I think we've been trying to get that cohesion of learning and facilitating that cohesion of learning between countries, between governments, even between private sector companies.
Excellent. So why don't we go to the audience? We've got some real rich content here. Let's get this gentleman. I think we might have my colleague Charlotte has, she's double mic there.
I'll try to be loud enough before then. For Chris.
Let's get you a mic, yeah. That way you don't have to strain your vocal cords there. Thank you.
Hey, for Chris, so you talked about voting in Indonesia. I was curious how you've used or seen cloud technologies used to either inform, enable, or execute voting in countries.
Yeah, so we very rarely work with the election commissions themselves that are implementing the actual voting process, but that same sort of like peer-to-peer learning is really taking place in that sector as well. Like the actual voting practices, if you go to a polling station and there's a ballot box that's made out of clear plastic with seals on it, and you take a ballot off of a pad and put it in the box, if you actually step through it, there's about 16 different safety measures that are built into the physicality of everything that takes place there. It makes like digital voting an actually really hard problem to solve. And so in our role as groups, as an organization that works with the groups that are trying to preserve kind of a free, open, transparent electoral process, we often try and encourage a little bit away from that, but at a different level, reporting results from the polling station level up to central databases, and aggregating, analyzing that sort of information that's taking place within the Electoral Commission themselves. Having the same sort of transformations on the inside there that it is for the political parties with their voter files and campaign communications, or the citizen monitoring groups that are trying to track the whole process.
Great. Great question. Another question?
Okay, sorry. My question is, understanding that a lot of the development efforts around the world are focused on specific population segments, whether it's women and children, youth, groups that face ethno-social discrimination, are your organizations targeting specific population segments with these initiatives focused on cloud? Are there initiatives like helping women or youth or individuals seeking higher education or skills-based learning to leverage cloud-based services or cloud service skills?
Thank you.
A big part of the work of the bank is again, bringing in the marginalized. But I would say that because a lot of our work is targeted towards the governments, we work within those structures. So yes, we would particularly work with a ministry that might have a project that's focusing on girls and education. But to answer your question, in the development world, and here I'm pulling from my experience in my previous experience, we have had efforts that are targeted for girls and children, for example, where projects or initiatives are helping girls code, for example, and helping them get either through teenage pregnancy and girls that cannot continue to go to school anymore, to help them get those technical schools through cloud programs that would get them a livelihood, either get them back in school or be able to get them to get a job that would pay enough to support their children. So yes, within the development world, there are those programs that are targeted to women and children.
Yeah. A really important question, and the kind of, more broadly, like the technology is disruptive and awesome in a lot of ways, but it can further marginalize those who are already on the fringes of society. Like if you are in a society where the woman in the household is less likely to have access to the family phone, you're locked out of those communication channels. If you are somebody who speaks only a local indigenous language and you don't speak some of the major languages, then you're locked out of the web. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to really think about what's happening to these groups who may be further pushed out of engagement with their governments or these other public sector institutions. NDI tries to think about that a lot. We have an entire team focused on gender, women, and democracy. Our citizen participation team runs a lot of youth-focused and LGBTI-focused programs. One specific example that we're really excited about that's coming forward in the next year here, my colleague Sarah in the audience is going to be running a program in Guatemala based on women in technology. So trying to help women in Guatemala out of the big cities and urban areas learn some of these skills and try and plug them back in again. I'll take the opportunity to mention another thing that we're excited about for the summer here that we're pulling from AWS. Not everybody has a broadband connection, not everybody has a smartphone, but an awful lot of people have access to mobile phones. Not everybody is literate. And so we think there's a lot of potential for voice-based interfaces that we think will help bring in some of these people who otherwise might be locked out. Now there's a huge problem there. Any of the voice chat systems as of now are going to be hitting the same major language groups that kind of dominate. So again, the indigenous local language speaker will still be locked out of that, but at least it cuts some of the technological barriers to entry for folks.
Thank you. We had another question? Uh-oh. Oh, we got one right here.
Marietta, thank you. This has been great. Question I have is, we have seen some examples of how cloud and technology is transforming a number of things across the globe. But yet we see that some governments are doing a lot of things, others don't. And I wonder what could trigger more action and leveraging technology? Is the lack of federal CTOs? How do we bring more leadership in government towards the benefits of technology?
I think a lot of it is there's things that we can do, but I think there's also things that time will sort out. So awareness is a big thing. It's always good to show what the technology has achieved or what you can actually do. Many of the people that we work with don't actually know how much you can use it. What can it do? They might see a few things on television. They might read something on an in-flight magazine, but they are not able to bring it home. The other thing, I think, the other myth is that it's costly. It's expensive. So it's debunking some of these myths around cloud that will help people get more comfortable in terms of how we could use it. And then being able, I think, to provide some live stories. Again, I think that the peer-to-peer learning would be useful. The other thing I think about in terms of, say, the clients that we work with is just being able to communicate not so much what you would get out of using cloud, but what will happen if you do not use cloud. Because where we're going, I think there was a Gartner report recently that said by 2019, 30% of all applications will be cloud-based. So, you will be cut out of the sort of mainstream if you don't. So I think some of those messages need to go out. And then the sensitization around what is the cost, how could you access it, what do you need in terms of learning or processes or people in terms of actually preparing yourself or your organization or even your nation to actually get there.
So could I piggyback?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, something that I think is a really interesting phenomenon around the world is the rise of this civic technology movement. There's so many young people in every country in which I've ever been that are really excited about technology, yes, in an entrepreneurial nature, but often in a kind of a social good focus. And so there's this cadre of young folks coming up that have technology chops or kind of getting there and a eagerness to change their societies for the better. So one of the challenges that we face, and I don't know whether you see this in your work, is that there's a disconnect between kind of the supply of these sharp young technologists and then kind of the demand from governments. The demand is there, but they don't necessarily know how to meet in the middle. And techies are really good at solving problems, but they're not necessarily solving the right problems. And they're not solving them in a politically savvy sort of way. And so I think this is a space to be worked on in the years to come here. How do we get those people mixing and engaging with each other?
And just to your point, when we think about Sub-Saharan Africa, and 50% of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa is between, more than 50% actually, between 14 and 18. Mm-hmm. So in 10 years' time, these are your adults. Mm-hmm. So time is going to override, and to your point around new technologies, the things that they expect out of their mobile phone, out of their daily life. In my country, for example, you would find that young people would rather pay a lot of money to get the data on their phone than to pay for their next meal. Mm. So it's those dynamics that change how cloud adoption will happen. It will almost overrun, I think, the society in some way. And it will just, technologies generally we'll just have to adopt or, die, as they say.
And it does provide, to the earlier question about groups that we might specifically want to target, provides a real opportunity for young people who understand technology. Yeah. It's the one space where the gray hair isn't considered an asset necessarily. And so you look at political parties globally, and most young people, and young people is usually defined as under 40, are locked into the youth wing. And they might be able to get to be Minister of Sport. That's it. So if you want to be able to move up and provide value for folks, you can break some of those hierarchies through understanding how to apply technology, again, to some sort of end, to win.
So this excellent exchange, and there's a follow-up, and then we'll go back to the audience that I had for both of you. But Marietta, you may want to start. So we were really kind of going in this direction where you were talking about how, organizations almost need to justify why they're not going to cloud at this point. And then you talked about sort of the laws of nature, and it's just going to happen. But between where we are now and when that actually happens, and you see folks just really running to implement cloud services, What can be done by the World Bank and by NDI and quite frankly all of us in the community to continue to enable this notion of cloud native policies, right? We talked many years ago about cloud first here in the US, and that took off internationally, but now everybody this week is talking about cloud native. How do we get to this sort of cloud native point in the policy process where, you know, governments are actually putting the right policies in place to enable this, not just in the public sector, but across the economy, so people are thinking cloud native?
Well, I can think of, I think, two ways. One, I think, is going to have to be the pressure of the telcos. And the reason I say the pressure of the telcos is thinking about the world generally, that's the pipe through which you have to get to the cloud. And to be able to use that lobby group to change policy and to change what happens to data in transit and data at rest for those. And the policies around what government expects of the telcos, because that will drive a lot of what happens. And I think the second one, the second point would just be that the governments themselves, I think, in terms of being able to deal with private sector, are going to have to change some of the ways that they come in. Otherwise, they probably will not be able to get the kinds of investment that they want.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
One thing I might add, we're very concerned about the it seems increasing trend of governments, not just the classic bad guy governments, but a lot of governments to manipulate, regulate, censor, shut down the internet. And as we encourage people to make a migration to cloud, broadly defined, like you cut that hose off and then people are really, really hurting. And, but this seems to increasingly be a policy response by governments when they feel that political risk. The internet's the public space of the 21st century here. And so one thing that I think we all want to try and advocate and work for are, norms and principles that, that people's connection to the internet, the free flow of information, the freedom to assemble online should be as sacrosanct digitally as it is in the physical space.
Excellent point. More questions from the audience. We have time for a couple more. Got one on this side of the room. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks. This is for Marietta. I don't know if you can speak to specific tools that the bank has that I'm familiar with, but one is the ESMAP tool, and the other is, I think it's called CURB. And for those who don't know, the ESMAP is sort of a rapid energy assessment tool that was earlier used in the urban planning space, and likewise CURB, I believe, is sort of an urban metabolism model in 4 sectors, and it's being deployed around the world now. So I don't know if you personally worked on those, but the question is, okay.
No, I haven't personally worked in them, but I do know that there are aspects, there are groups within what we call our global practices, the groups that look particularly at, say, sanitation, water and sanitation, or economics, that have specific tools that they use that are available for governments to use, whether it's modeling how you would build a bridge, or whether it's looking at how you would organize a city. But I'm not personally
so
familiar
I'll try to
with
reframe it more broadly. What I'd like to ask actually is just this isn't specific to those tools, but it's a broad challenge, I guess, is just how to contextualize like rapid assessments or systems approach modeling tools, where often, especially in international development context, the data isn't there, and so proxy data substitutes a dearth of data. It can be in a specific sector, but that actually comes from a totally different system, and it's potentially problematic if it. I know that this is something that, for example, those teams are aware of, but the question is whether or not there can be discussions. I'll just try to say this diplomatically, to bring in more of a granular ground truthing, whether it's through CGIS or just ensuring that there's an open, open source of some of the software tools that currently aren't.
Okay. I think we got the question. Mary, you want to try to take that?
No, because I don't quite know how to answer that. What I can do is maybe we can talk offline, and I can put you in touch with the people at the bank that would be able to provide some of the why we don't use the granular data. I'm sure there are valid reasons, but I couldn't point them at this time? Okay.
Okay. So
One,
we can,
if I may on that,
yeah,
one,
go ahead.
I think there's an interesting point there. There's places that are like infrastructure poor, you know, financially poor, maybe poor in technology capacity. They're often data poor. And so there's a real challenge if you're an emerging economy or democracy. You don't have access to these huge data stores to begin with. You have to build them from somewhere. You know, in Liberia, they're not going to be putting like IoT devices on every bridge to try and track anything for a long time yet to come. They don't have bridges in the places they need to have bridges to start with. So I think one thing that's exciting in this space is the potential for machine learning to try and pull in unstructured data sets and try and make sense out of it, turn that into some sort of actual, concrete, actionable data that they can work with in the future.
Excellent. So we have time for 2 more quick questions. We've got this gentleman here.
Hi, Marietta. Question about data sovereignty, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So you'd mentioned that part of the World Bank's activity with governments is helping to provide some advice and guidance as to how to tackle the data sovereignty issue. Is there anything, and I believe you mentioned the Cloud for Development program, is there anything formal that the bank is doing to help governments get ready to tackle this issue?
Actually, yeah, that's an interesting question. We're currently thinking about and looking to partner with AWS on a POC, a proof of concept that really is trying to see how can governments better use the cloud to look at their statistical information tools and so on to be able to do that work. So currently, either governments have data centers or don't. And some of these offices, you know, it's very fragmented. So the POC is an understanding with AWS to look further into that particular concept of how governments would be able to use the cloud to do that. And yes, and I think the question of data sovereignty will come into that. It's something that would be part of the POC, while it's not a production or it's not meant to sort of be available to all governments. At least it will provide more information and actually more learning around how we could handle that and how governments therefore could use cloud for some of their more sensitive workloads.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So we have time for 1 more question. Do we have a taker? Right over here.
Chris, you were mentioning before that there's a lot of regions that you work with that are data poor. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives that NDI is working on related to open data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So the interesting thing about open data is that it's useless by itself. You need to have people who can digest it, consume it, digest it, and then make it useful for the citizens writ large, for leaders in political parties, for government leaders, for the actual policymakers. And so in some ways, like, open data, while incredibly important, can be a bit of a red herring. Like, the goal is to gather the information that you can from the sources that you can, and then put it in the hands of the right people. Now, sometimes open is the right way to do that, but in a data poor place, there isn't a lot of feeds that are just sitting out there that need to be consolidated and aggregated. So it is, I think, an important part of the development of public sector institutions going forward here. Like, as they start to build data sets, then pushing them to default to open. This is public information. It belongs to the public. It should be put out there. While recognizing that not everything can be, kind of having people come in with a mentality of sharing stuff. Now, technology can be a little bit interesting for that, in that since it's new, people may not come in with the same sort of rigid mindset about everything that's government should be secret and confidential or whatever. We've had some luck in places working with legislatures, voting records, bill tracking systems, and other kind of transparency and openness initiatives to try and get that information out there for the public. But one of the things that we find super important is that you have to have someone then who can replay that for the broader world, or else it's useless. It's a tree falling in the forest that nobody's there to hear.
Excellent. Did you want to comment as well?
No, I think
okay.
I'm good.
So since we have a couple minutes left, let me just ask each of you a question. We talked a little bit about some of the transformational things that you're doing within your organization. So if you're a new government out there in the audience here, as well as folks who will be watching a webcast at some point, what advice would you give to a government or an institution, a political party, on how to best use cloud now to transform their organization? What are some of the processes and policies that they should consider adopting now?
I kind of say jump in and get started. There's the power and the potential for cloud, which is such a nebulous, no pun intended, term, but it's that people don't have to worry about the technology stuff so much anymore. And so by removing that layer of technical challenges, those hurdles to get over, it really helps groups get started. And they can get started not just by trying to figure it out on their own, but tapping into these kind of global networks of peers. Like, find other people who are doing something similar. The South-to-South collaboration that you mentioned earlier is so important. Find the local civic technology groups that are probably incredibly eager to work with you, help you serve as informal innovation teams supporting the work that you're doing. And pilot something, get started and try it out.
Wonderful.
I would probably say to them, focus on the local problem. Don't try and fix something that someone has fixed already. And there are loads of local problems. And the reason I would say that is because a local problem is really your low-hanging fruit. And it's that's going to get you the momentum to keep going. Something small, something that's local, something for which you can see your results really quick, and something that has impact for you. So to the point that I mentioned earlier, the health system strengthening was a real problem, simply because when a child reaches 6, they have to go to school and they need this paper, which paper doesn't exist. So that's a local problem that you could really quickly fix. And that's probably where the bulk of the momentum, in my view, would actually come from.
Excellent. Well, I think this is the first time in my moderation of panels over the years that we've ended exactly on time, and I give that credit to our 2 star panelists here. Really wonderful having you both with us today for this session and here at the summit, and thank you all for coming. Hand for the panelists.